After my return from the Terai, I was occupied during the month of April in preparations for an expedition to the loftier parts of Sikkim. The arrangements were the same as for my former journey, except with regard to food, which it was necessary should be sent out to me at intervals. For we had had ample proof that the resources of the country were not equal to provisioning a party of from 40 to 50 men, even had the Dewan been favorable to my traveling, which was clearly not the case. Dr. Campbell communicated to the Raja my intention of starting early in May for the upper Thista Valley, and, in the Governor-General's name, requested that he would facilitate my visiting the frontier of Sikkim, northeast of Kanchenjunga. The desired permission was, after a little delay, received, which appeared to rouse the Dewan to institute a series of obstructions to my progress, which caused so many delays that my exploration of the country was not concluded till October, and I was prevented returning to Darjeeling before the following Christmas. Since our visit to the Raja in December, no vakil, agent, had been sent by the Durbar to Darjeeling, and consequently, we could only communicate indirectly with His Highness, while we found it impossible to ascertain the truth of various reports promulgated by the Dewan, and meant to deter me from entering the country. In April, the Lasu Kaji was sent as vakil, but, having on a previous occasion been dismissed for insolence and incapacity, and again rejected when proposed by the Dewan at Bomsong, he was refused an audience, and he encamped at the bottom of the great Runjeet Valley, where he lost some of his party through fever. He retired into Sikkim, exasperated, pretending that he had orders to delay my starting, in consequence of the death of the heir apparent, and that he was prepared to use strong measures should I cross the frontier. No notice was taken of these threats. The Raja was again informed of my intended departure, unless his own orders to the contrary were received through a proper accredited agent, and I left Darjeeling on the 3rd of May, accompanied by Dr. Campbell, who insisted on seeing me fairly over the frontier at the great Runjeet River. Arrangements were made for supplies of rice following me by installments, our daily consumption being 80 pounds, a man's load. After crossing into Sikkim, I mustered my party at the great Runjeet River. I had 42 in all, of whom the majority were young Lepchas, or Sikkim-born people of Tibetan races. All were active and cheerful-looking fellows. Only one was goitered, and he had been a salt trader. I was accompanied by a guard of 5 sepoys, and had a Lepcha and Tibetan interpreter. I took but one personal servant, a Portuguese half-caste, John Hoffman by name, who cooked for me. He was a native of Calcutta, and though hardy, patient, and long-suffering, and far better tempered, was, in other respects, very inferior to Clemens, who had been my servant the previous year, and who, having been bred to the sea, was as handy as he was clever, but who, like all other natives of the plains, grew intolerably weary of the hills, and left me. The first part of my route lay over Tendong, a very fine mountain, which rises 8,613 feet, and is a conspicuous feature from Darjeeling, where it is known as Mount Ararat. The Lepchas have a curious legend of a man and woman having saved themselves on its summit during a flood that once deluged Sikkim. The coincidence of this story with the English name of Ararat suggests the probability of the legend being fabulous, but I am positively assured that it is not so, but that it was current amongst the Lepchas before its English name was heard of, and that the latter was suggested from the peculiar form of its summit resembling that given in children's books as the resting place of the ark. The ascent from the Great Runjeet, alt. 818 feet, is through dry woods of sal and pines, p. longifolia. I camped the first night at the village of Mick, alt. 3,900 feet, and on the following day ascended to Namk, alt. 5,600 feet. On the route, I was met by the Lama of Silikfok Gumpa. Though a resident on the Lasu Khaji's estates, he politely brought me a present, at the same time apologizing for not waiting till I had encamped, owing to his excessive fat, which prevented his climbing. I accepted his excuses, though well aware that his real reason was that he wished to pay his respects and show his good feeling in private. Besides his ordinary canonicals, he carried a tall crozier-headed staff, and had a curious horn slung round his neck, full of amulets. It was short, of a transparent red color, and beautifully carved, and was that of the small cow of Lhasa, which resembles the English species, and is not a yak. It is called tundro. Namche was once a place of considerable importance, and still possesses a mendong, with 6 rows of inscribed slabs, a temple, and a lama attached thereto. The latter waited on me soon after I had encamped, but he brought no present, and I was not long kept in suspense as to his motives. These people are poor dissemblers. If they intend to obstruct, they do it clumsily and hesitatingly. In this instance, the Lama first made up to my people, and, being coolly received, kept gradually edging up to my tent door, where, after an awkward salute, he delivered himself with a very bad grace of his mission, which was from the Lasu Khaji to stop my progress. I told him I knew nothing of the Lasu Khaji or his orders, and should proceed on the following morning. He then urged the bad state of the roads, and advised me to wait 2 days till he should receive orders from the Raja, upon which I dismissed him. Soon afterwards, as I sat at my tent door, looking along the narrow bushy ridge that winds up the mountain, I saw 20 or 30 men rapidly descending the rocky path. They were Lepchas, with blue and white striped garments, bows and quivers, and with their long knives gleaming in the sun. They seemed to be following a figure in red lama costume, with a scarlet silk handkerchief wound round his head, its ends streaming behind him. Though expecting this apparition to prove the renowned Khaji and his myrmidons, coming to put a sudden termination to my progress, I could not help admiring the exceeding picturesqueness of the scenery and party. My fears were soon dissipated by my men joyfully shouting, "The Chibu Lama! The Chibu Lama!" And I soon recognized the rosy face and twinkling eyes of my friend of Bomsong, the only man of intelligence about the Raja's court, and the one whose services as vakil were particularly wanted at Dorjiling. He told me that the Lasu Khaji had orders, from whom, he would not say, to stop my progress, but that I should proceed nevertheless, and that there was no objection to my doing so. And he dispatched a messenger to the Raja, announcing my progress, and requesting him to send me a guide, and to grant me every facility, asserting that he had all along fully intended doing so. On the following morning the Lama proceeded to Dorjiling, and I continued the ascent of Tendong, sending my men round the shoulder to Temi in the Thista Valley, where I proposed to pass the night. The road rapidly ascends by a narrow, winding path, covered with a loose forest of oaks, rhododendrons, and various shrubs, not found at equal elevations on the wetter Dorjiling ranges. Amongst them the beautiful laburnum, like Piptanthus nepalensis, with golden blossoms, was conspicuous. Enormous blocks of white and red stratified quartz and slate, some 20 and even 40 yards long, rest on the narrow ridge at 7,000 feet elevation. The last ascent is up a steep, rounded cone with a broad, flat top, covered with dwarf bamboo, a few oaks, laurels, magnolias, and white-flowered rhododendron trees. Argentium, which obstructed the view. I hung the barometers near one of the many chates on the summit, where there is also a rude temple, in which worship is performed once a year. The elevation is 8,671 feet by my observations, 8,663 by Colonel Waugh's trigonometrical observations. The geological formation of Tendong in some measure accounts for its peculiar form. On the conical summit are hard quartzose porphyries, which have apparently forced up the gneiss and slates, which dip in all directions from the top, and are full of injected veins of quartz. Below 7,000 feet, mica schist prevails, always inclined at a very high angle, and I found jasper near Namche, with other indications of plutonic action. The descent on the north side was steep, through a rank vegetation, very different from that of the south face. The oaks are very grand, and I measured one, whose trunk was decayed, and split into three, however, which I found to be 49 feet in girth at 5 feet from the ground. Near Temi, Alt, for 1,770 feet, I gathered the fruit of Kedsura, a climbing plant allied to magnolia, bearing round heads of large fleshy red drupes, which are pleasantly acid and much eaten. The seeds are very aromatic. From Temi the road descends to the Thistha, the course of which it afterwards follows. The valley was fearfully hot and infested with mosquitoes and peepses. Many fine plants grew in it, especially upon the broad terraces of gravel, some of which are upwards of a mile long, and 200 feet above the stream. They are covered with boulders of rock, and are generally opposite feeders of the river. I especially noticed Aristolochia saccata, which climbs the loftiest trees, bearing its curious pitcher-shaped flowers near the ground only. Its leaves are said to be good food for cattle. Hautuinia, a curious herb allied to pepper, grew on the banks, which, from the profusion of its white flowers, resembled strawberry beds. The leaves are eaten by the lepches. But the most magnificent plant of these jungles is Hodgsonia, a genus I have dedicated to my friend, Mr. Hodgson, a gigantic climber allied to the gourd, bearing immense yellowish-white pendulous blossoms, whose petals have a fringe of buff-colored curling threads, several inches long. The fruit is of a rich brown, like a small melon in form, and contains 6 large nuts, whose kernels, called kadier pod by the lepches, are eaten. The stem, when cut, discharges water profusely from whichever end is held downwards. The tuk, Hydnocarpus, is a beautiful evergreen tree, with tufts of yellow blossoms on the trunk. Its fruit is as large as an orange, and is used to poison fish, while from the seeds an oil is expressed. Tropical oaks and terminalias are the giants of these low forests, the latter especially, having buttressed trunks, appear truly gigantic. One, of a kind called Sung Lok, measured 47 feet in girth at 5 feet, and 21 at 15 feet from the ground, and was fully 200 feet high. I could only procure the leaves by firing a ball into the crown. Some of their trunks lay smoldering on the ground, emitting a curious smell from the mineral matter in their ashes, of whose constituents an account will be found in the appendix. Birds are very rare, as is all animal life but insects, and a small freshwater crab, Thelphusa, T. of the Lepsius. Shells, from the absence of lime, are extremely scarce, and I scarcely picked up a single specimen. The most common are species of Cyclostoma. The rains commenced on the 10th of May, greatly increasing the discomforts of traveling, but moderating the heat by drenching thunderstorms, which so soaked the men's loads that I was obliged to haul the day in the Thista Valley to have waterproof covers made of plaited bamboo work, enclosing phrynium leaves. I was delighted to find that my little tent was impervious to water, though its thickness was but of one layer of blanket. It was a single ridge with 2 poles, 7 feet high, 8 feet long, and 8 feet broad at the base, forming nearly an equilateral triangle in front. Bomsong was looking more beautiful than ever in its rich summer clothing of tropical foliage. I halted during an hour of heavy rain on the spot where I had spent the previous Christmas, and could not help feeling doubly lonely in a place where every rock and tree reminded me of that pleasant time. The isolation of my position, the hostility of the Dewan, and consequent uncertainty of the success of a journey that absorbed all my thoughts, the prevalence of fevers in the valleys I was traversing, and the many difficulties that beset my path, all crowded on the imagination when fevered by exertion and depressed by gloomy weather. And my spirits involuntarily sank as I counted the many miles and months intervening between me and my home. The little flat on which I had formerly encamped was now covered with a bright green crop of young rice. The house then occupied by the Dewan was now empty and unroofed, but the suspension bridge had been repaired, and its light framework of canes, spanning the boiling flood of the Thista, formed a graceful object in this most beautiful landscape. The temperature of the river was 58 degrees, only 7 degrees above that of midwinter, owing to the now melting snows. I had rather expected to meet either with a guide or with some further obstruction here, but as none appeared, I proceeded onwards as soon as the weather moderated. Illustration: Pandanus, Sikkim screw pine. Higher up, the scenery resembles that of Chintam on the Tamba. The banks are so steep as to allow of no road, and the path ascends from the river at 1,000 feet to Lathiang village at 4,800 feet, up a wild, rocky torrent that descends from Mainam to the Thista. The cliffs here are covered with wild plantains and screw pines, Pandanus, 50 feet high, that clasp the rocks with cable-like roots, and bear 1 or 2 crowns of drooping leaves, 5 feet long. 2 palms, rattan, calamus, and Erica gracilis, penetrate thus far up the Thista Valley, but are scarcely found further. From the village the view was superb, embracing the tropical gully below, with the flat of Bomsong deep down in the gorge, its bright rice fields gleaming like emeralds amid the dark vegetation that surrounded it. The Thiesthal winding to the southward, the pine-clad rocky top of Mainam, 10,613 feet high. To the southwest, the cone of Mount Ararat far to the south, to the north Black Mountains tipped with snow, and to the east the magnificent snowy range of Chola, girdling the valley of the Riot with a diadem of frosted silver. The coolies, each carrying upwards of 80 pounds load, had walked 12 hours that day, and besides descending 2,000 feet, they had ascended nearly 4,000 feet and gone over innumerable ups and downs besides. Beyond Lathiang, a steep and dangerous path runs along the east flank of Mainam, sometimes on narrow ledges of dry rock, covered with long grass, sometimes dipping into wooded gullies, full of Edgeworthia gardenery and small trees of Andromeda and rhododendron, covered with orchids, especially some species of Sinipia and Cirripetalum, which have not yet been introduced into England, of great beauty. Descending to Gore, for 1,100 feet, I was met by the Lama of that district, a tall, disagreeable-looking fellow, who informed me that the road ahead was impassable. The day being spent, I was obliged to camp at any rate, after which he visited me in full canonicals, bringing me a handsome present, but assuring me that he had no authority to let me advance. I treated him with civility, and regretted my objects being so imperative and my orders so clear that I was obliged to proceed on the following morning, on which he abruptly decamped, as I suspected, in order to damage the paths and bridges. He came again at daylight, and expostulated further, but finding it of no use, he volunteered to accompany me, officiously offering me the choice of 2 roads. I asked for the coolest, knowing full well that it was useless to try and outwit him in such matters. At the first stream the bridge was destroyed, but seeing the planks peeping through the bushes in which they had been concealed, I desired the Lama to repair it, which he did without hesitation. So it was at every point. The path was cumbered with limbs of trees, crossing stones were removed from the streams, and all natural difficulties were increased. I kept constantly telling the Lama that as he had volunteered to show me the road, I felt sure he intended to remove all obstacles, and accordingly I put him to all the trouble I possibly could, which he took with a very indifferent grace. When I arrived at the swinging bridge across the Thiesthal, I found that the canes were loosened, and that slips of bamboo, so small as nearly to escape observation, were ingeniously placed low down over the single bamboo that formed the footing, intended to trip up the unwary passenger and overturn him into the river, which was deep and with a violent current. Whilst the Lama was cutting these, one of my party found a charcoal writing on a tree, announcing the speedy arrival from the Raja of my old guide, Mipo, and he shortly afterwards appeared, with instructions to proceed with me, though not to the Tibetan frontier. The lateness of the season, the violence of the rains, and the fears, on the Raja's part, that I might suffer from fever or accident, were all urged to induce me to return, or at least only to follow the west branch of the Thiesthal to Kinchenjunga. These reasons failing, I was threatened with Chinese interference on the frontier. All these objections I overruled by refusing to recognize any instructions that were not officially communicated to the superintendent of Dorjiling. The Gore Lama here took leave of me. He was a friend of the Dewan, and was rather surprised to find that the Raja had sent me a guide, and now attempted to pass himself off as my friend, pompously charging Meepo with the care of me, and bidding me a very polite farewell. I could not help telling him civilly, but plainly, what I thought of him, and so we parted. Meepo was very glad to join my party again. He is a thorough lecturer in heart, a great friend of his Raja and of Chibu Lama, and one who both fears and hates the Dewan. He assured me of the Raja's good wishes and intentions, but spoke with great doubt as to the probability of a successful issue to my journey. He was himself ignorant of the road, but had brought a guide, whose appearance, however, was against him, and who turned out to be sent as a spy on us both. Instead of crossing the Thistha here, we kept on for 2 days up its west bank, to a cane bridge at Lingo, where the bed of the river is still only 2,000 feet above the sea, though 45 miles distant from the plains, and flowing in a valley bounded by mountains 12,000 to 16,000 feet high. The heat was oppressive from the closeness of the atmosphere, the great power of the sun, now high at noonday, and the reflection from the rocks. Leeches began to swarm as the damp increased, and stinging flies of various kinds. My clothes were drenched with perspiration during 5 hours of every day, and the crystallizing salt irritated the skin. On sitting down to rest, I was overcome with languor and sleep, and, but for the copious supply of fresh water everywhere, traveling would have been intolerable. The coolies were all but naked, and were constantly plunging into the pools of the rivers, for, though filthy in their persons, they revel in cold water in summer. They are powerful swimmers, and will stem a very strong current, striking out with each arm alternately. It is an animated sight when 20 or 30 of these swarthy children of nature are disporting their muscular figures in the water, diving after large fish, and sometimes catching them by tickling them under the stones. Of plants I found few not common at similar elevations below Dorjiling, except another kind of tree fern, Alsophylla spinulosa, the pugjic of the lepchas, who eat the soft watery pith. It is abundant in East Bengal and the peninsula of India. The other Sikkim tree fern, A. gigantea, is far more common from the level of the plains to 6,500 elevation, and is found as far south as Java, whose pith is eaten in times of scarcity. The India rubber fig penetrates thus far amongst the mountains, but is of small size. A gentian, arenaria, and some subalpine plants are met with, though the elevation is only 2,000 feet, and the whole climate thoroughly tropical. They were annuals usually found at 7,000 to 10,000 feet elevation, and were growing here on mossy rocks, cooled by the spray of the river, whose temperature was only 56.3 degrees. My servant having severely sprained his wrist by a fall, the lepchas wanted to apply a moxa, which they do by lighting a piece of puffball or Nepal paper that burns like tinder, laying it on the skin, and blowing it till a large open sore is produced. They shook their heads at my treatment, which consisted in transferring some of the leeches from our persons to the inflamed part. After crossing the Thistha by the cane bridge of Lingo, our route lay over a steep and lofty spur, round which the river makes a great sweep. On the ascent of this ridge we passed large villages on flats cultivated with buckwheat. The saddle is 5,500 feet high, and thence a rapid descent leads to the village of Singtam, which faces the north, and is 300 feet lower and 3,000 feet above the river, which is here no longer called the Thistha, but is known as the Lakan Lachung, from its double origin in the rivers of these names, which unite at Chungtam, 20 miles higher up. Of these, the source of the Lakan is in the Kalamu Lakes in Tibet, while the Lachung rises on the south flank of Dankia Mountain, both many marches north of my present position. At Singtam, the Lakban Lachung runs westward, till joined by the Rihi from the north, and the Renung from the west, after receiving which it assumes the name of Thistha. Of these affluents, the Renung is the largest, and drains the southeast face of Kinchenjunga and Pundim, and the north of Nursing, all which mountains are seen to the north-northwest of Singtam. The Renung Valley is cultivated for several miles up, and has amongst others the village and lamasery of Ba. Beyond this, the view of black, rugged precipices with snowy mountains towering above them is one of the finest in Sikkim. There is a pass in that direction, from Ba over the Tongla to the Thlonic Valley, and thence to the province of Jagatsi in Tibet, but it is almost impracticable. Illustration: view of Kinchenjunga from Singtam, looking northwestward. A race of wild men, called Haramamo, are said to inhabit the head of the valley, living in the woods of a district called Mundpua, beyond Ba. Tbei shun habitations, speak an unintelligible tongue, have more hair on the face than Lepchas, and do not plait that of their heads, but wear it in a knot. They use the bow and arrow, and eat snakes and vermin, which the Lepchas will not touch. Such is the account I have heard, and which is certainly believed in Sikkim. Similar stories are very current in half-civilized countries, and if this has any truth, it possibly refers to the Chepangs. Hodgson, in Bengal Asiatic Society's Journal for 1848, a very remarkable race, of doubtful affinity and origin, inhabiting the Nepal forests. At Singtam, I was waited on by the Soba of the district, a tall, portly Bhotia, who was destined to prove a most active enemy to my pursuits. He governs the country between Gore and the Tibet frontier for the Maharani, wife of the Raja, whose dowry it is, and she being the Dewan's relative, I had little assistance to expect from her agent. His conduct was very polite, and he brought me a handsome offering for myself. But after delaying me a day on the pretext of collecting food for my people, of which I was in want, I was obliged to move on with no addition to my store, and trust to obtaining some at the next village, or from Dorjiling. Owing, however, to the increasing distance and the destruction of the roads by the rains, my supplies from that place were becoming irregular. I therefore thought it prudent to reduce my party by sending back my guard of sepoys, who could be of no further use. From this point, the upper portion of the course of the Thistha, Lakan Lachung, is materially different from what it is lower down, becoming a boisterous torrent, as suddenly as the Tamba does above Maiwagwala. Its bed is narrower, large masses of rock impede its course, nor is there any place where it is practicable for rafts at any season, the only means of passing it being by cane bridges that are thrown across, high above the stream. The slope on either side of the valley is very steep, that on the north, in particular, appearing too precipitous for any road, and being only frequented by honey-seekers, who scale the rocks by cane ladders, and thus reach the pendulous bees' nests, which are so large as in some instances to be conspicuous features at the distance of a mile. This pursuit appeared extremely perilous, the long thread like canes in many places affording the only footing over many yards of cliff. The procuring of this honey, however, is the only means by which many of the idle poor raise the rent which they must pay to the Rajah. The most prominent effect of the steepness of the valleys is the prevalence of landslips, which sometimes descend for 3,000 feet, carrying devastation along their course. They are caused either by the melting of the snow beds on the mountains or by the action of the rains on the stratified rocks, and are much increased in effect and violence by the heavy timber trees which, swaying forwards, loosen the earth at their roots, and give impetus to the mass. This phenomenon is as frequent and destructive as in Switzerland, where, however, more lives are lost, from the country being more populous, and from the people recklessly building in places particularly exposed to such accidents. A most destructive one had, however, occurred here the previous year, by which a village was destroyed, together with 12 of its inhabitants, and all the cattle. The fragments of rock precipitated are sometimes of enormous size, but being a soft mica schist, are soon removed by weathering. It is in the rainy season that landslips are most frequent, and shortly after rain they are pretty sure to be heard far or near. I crossed the debris of the great one alluded to, on the first march beyond Singtam. The whole face of the mountain appeared more or less torn up for fully a mile, presenting a confused mass of white micaceous clay, full of angular masses of rock. The path was very difficult and dangerous, being carried along the steep slope, at an angle, in some places, of 35 degrees, and it was constantly shifting, from the continued downward sliding, and from the action of streams, some of which are large, and cut deep channels. In one I had the misfortune to lose my only sheep, which was carried away by the torrent. These streams were crossed by means of sticks and rickety bamboos, and the steep sides, sometimes 20 or 30 feet high, were ascended by notched poles. The weather continued very hot for the elevation, for 1,000 to 5,000 feet. The rain brought no coolness, and for the greater part of the 3 marches between Singtam and Chakhom, we were either wading through deep mud or climbing over rocks. Leeches swarmed in incredible profusion in the streams and damp grass, and among the bushes. They got into my hair, hung on my eyelids, and crawled up my legs and down my back. I repeatedly took upwards of 100 from my legs, where the small ones used to collect in clusters on the instep. The sores which they produced were not healed for 5 months afterwards, and I retain the scars to the present day. Snuff and tobacco leaves are the best antidote, but when marching in the rain, it is impossible to apply this simple remedy to any advantage. The best plan I found to be rolling the leaves over the feet, inside the stockings, and powdering the legs with snuff. Another pest is a small midge or sand fly, which causes intolerable itching and subsequent irritation, and is in this respect the most insufferable torment in Sikkim. The minutest rent in one's clothes is detected by the acute senses of this insatiable bloodsucker, which is itself so small as to be barely visible without a microscope. We daily arrived at our camping ground, streaming with blood, and mottled with the bites of peepses, gnats, midges, and mosquitoes, besides being infested with ticks. As the rains advanced, insects seemed to be called into existence in countless swarms. Large and small moths, cockchafers, glowworms, and cockroaches made my tent a Noah's Ark by night. When the candle was burning, together with winged ants, mayflies, flying earwigs, and many beetles, while a very large species of tipula, daddy long legs, swept its long legs across my face as I wrote my journal or plotted off my map. After retiring to rest and putting out the light, they gradually departed, except a few which could not find the way out and remained to disturb my slumbers. Chakung is a remarkable spot in the bottom of the valley, at an angle of the Lochen Lachung, which here receives an affluent from Naram, a mountain 17,557 feet high, on the Chola Range to the east. This is called Black Rock in Colonel Waugh's map. I doubt Naram being a generally known name. The people hardly recognize the mountain as sufficiently conspicuous to bear a name. There is no village, but some grass huts used by travelers, which are built close to the river on a very broad flat, fringed with alder, hornbeam, and birch. The elevation is 4,400 feet, and many European genera not found about Darjeeling, and belonging to the temperate Himalaya, grow intermixed with tropical plants that are found no further north. The birch, willow, alder, and walnut grow side by side with wild plantain, erythrina, wallachia palm, and gigantic bamboos. The cedrela tuna, figs, melastoma, cytominii, balsams, pothos, peppers, and gigantic climbing vines grow mixed with brambles, speedwell, paris, forget-me-not, and nettles that sting like poisoned arrows. The wild English strawberry is common, but bears a tasteless fruit. Its inferiority is, however, counterbalanced by the abundance of a grateful yellow raspberry. Parasitical orchids, Dendrobium nobile and Densiflorum, etc., cover the trunks of oaks, while Thalictrum and geranium grow under their shade. Monotropa and Balanophora, both parasites on the roots of trees, the one a native of North Europe and the other of a tropical climate, push their leafless stems and heads of flowers through the soil together. And lastly, tree ferns grow associated with the Pteris aquilina, brake, and Lycopodium clavatum of our British moors, and amongst mosses, the superb Himalayan Laelia crispa. This is one of the most remarkable mosses in the Himalaya mountains, and derives additional interest from having been named after the late Charles Lyell, Esq. of Kinnerdy, the father of the most eminent geologist of the present day, with the English Funaria hygrometrica. The dense jungles of Chakung completely cover the beautiful flat terraces of stratified sand and gravel, which rise in 3 shelves to 150 feet above the river, and whose edges appear as sharply cut as if the latter had but lately retired from them. They are continuous with a line of quartzy cliffs, covered with scarlet rhododendrons, and in the holes of which a conglomerate of pebbles is found, 150 feet above the river. Everywhere immense boulders are scattered about, some of which are 60 yards long. Their surfaces are water-worn into hollows, proving the river to have cut through nearly 300 feet of deposit, which once floored its valley. Lower down the valley, and fully 2,000 feet above the river, I had passed numerous angular blocks resting on gentle slopes where no landslips could possibly have deposited them. and which I therefore refer to ancient glacial action. One of these, near the village of Nyong, was nearly square, 80 feet long, and 10 high.